Walter, let's start with the tone of the country, because it seems to me like we're slipping back into that mindset of everybody's got to choose sides, and it's a binary decision. You are either pro police or you're against police, against law enforcement. Do you get that same sense?
Yeah, the issue about policing has, in my view, rarely been nuanced. And we go to how often people feel disappointed when criminal charges are not filed against a police officer after a fatal use of force. And there is a presumption almost that, well, there must have been some sort of a fix or a conspiracy that allowed that to happen. When the reality is that the standard for the use of lethal force in the United States, based upon a Supreme Court ruling, is generally so broad that an officer is given an immense amount of discretion to use lethal force in certain circumstances.
So you start with what many people would say is a very low threshold for use of force. And then you add to that the fact that a police officer, say in Scranton, Pennsylvania, is not operating under the same guidelines, rules, and policies as, say, an officer with LAPD, correct?
Well, I think we're not even at a stage right now where an officer in Scranton has the necessarily is under the same policy and standards as an officer in Pittsburgh or an officer in Allentown. Right now, use of force policies are generally dictated by local policy. And that makes it really difficult to understand what is the standard. So I think both uniformity in standards, such as use of force, uniformity in the certification and decertification of officers who engage in misconduct, uniformity in data collection and data transparency. Those are all areas which are ripe for the increased regulation of policing, either at the state or at the federal level.
Walter, do we have any sense of what the rank and file police officers think about all this? We've certainly heard from police associations, the unions, their leadership. But do we have a sense of how these measures and these reforms are being talked about among the rank and file frontline officers?
I don't think there is one answer. We see that in some cities, the police union leadership has taken very political positions, in fact, sometimes very partisan positions, for example, in the presidential election. And then as they have done so, not all of the rank and file are supporting it. We see, for example, that the leadership of police unions tends to be far less diverse than the rank and file. So I think it depends who you ask. I think if one thing became clear out of this past summer is that the protests and the movement for change has been significantly politicized. Um, Whenever we've seen protests that appear to get out of control with buildings being burned or objects being thrown at officers, those tend to have been then turned into emblematic of the entire movement for reform. And that has been counterproductive. And then there's some even more troubling aspects to it. So, for example, a member of a far right extremist group was arrested in Texas, and he is accused of having helped set fire to the precinct house in Minneapolis and used an assault rifle to fire rounds into the precinct house. He wasn't a police reform activist. In fact, he was just the opposite of that. But that was politicized. And so, in this moment of hyperpartisanship, where everything is politicized, I think it has made it more difficult for rank and file officers to be heard. It has also made it more difficult for advocates to be heard. And very often, the voice of advocates who are from the community, their voices have been co opted by others.
And is real reform even possible in that environment?
Yeah, I think it's a wait and see attitude. I mean, the House passed the George Floyd Act. Legislation came out of the Senate, led by Senator Tim Scott, as well as a qualified immunity reform measure that came out of the Senate. So we saw some at least movement. But keep in mind, there are also opportunities at the state level as well. And we are very intrigued by them and watching them closely. Um, I think there is potential for reform which can come from both sides of the political aisle in a number of states where there's a recognition that there is a need for greater transparency and accountability of policing. And I am really optimistic as to what is possible.